really do love my devices. And if there's a technology that can make my life easier, I'm always keen to explore it. But I also have to confess that part of a little bit of the interest has to do with the fact that when I met my husband, he was doing his PhD in artificial intelligence. So we do talk a little bit geek, not so much. But one of my big bugbears with the technologies has been the imbalance between the technology that allows me to do what I want to do, and the technology that allows me to do what I want, the way that I want to do it, but do it better, versus the technology that sets up how it should be done based on someone else's idea of what might be helpful, and that requires that I adapt what I do to the existing technology. Now, this imbalance often occurs because the developers try to achieve efficiency through a one-size-fits-all, and you can see why it makes sense to do a one-size-fits-all approach, or because there's insufficient collaboration and engagement and involvement between the developers, the users, and the clients. But over the last 3 to 4 years, I've had the fortune, or in some cases misfortune, of being involved with various initiatives in health, whether it's they're all supposed to enhance health, whether it's monitoring health, delivering health, or improving health systems, and whether it's e-health or m-health or telehealth or digital health or health informatics of some kind. But the problem, again, is that a lot of it has been driven by the excitement about the digital age. And the sense that it's a solution. And I'd like to query again, being disruptive, that it is an enabler in health. It may be a solution in other areas, but in health it is very much an enabler. It's not a solution. And therefore the concern is that if the people on the other end, whether it's a health system, whether it's the technology used by the health system for the purposes of a client, or whether it's about the health system people who are using it and so on, there are a lot of people factors within that at least the engagement that I have had so far has kind of neglected a little bit, and it has been largely technology driven. Now again, I know that I'm oversimplifying the issues and so on, but I do think that at least in the more misfortune bits of my engagement with this area, that there's enough noise in the space that if we don't make extra noise from the bottom, a whole lot of people are going to lose out. So from IIGH's perspective, as we go through the discussions, and bearing in mind the discussions that we've had this morning, I do want us to very much think about the people end of what we're doing, with a focus on gender, equity, and human rights. And so I will now hand over to those who actually have expertise in this area to lead the rest of the afternoon's discussion. Welcome again, and I hope we enjoy the next 2.5 days. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. So we are going to have 4 speakers. We have 3 invited speakers. We have Mamelu and Araba Sey from UNU Computing and Society, and we have Anisti Lefebvre from the University of Cape Town. So we are going to have 2 talks followed by a break and then 2 other talks. And the main ideas of the talks is to progress from a discussion of the gender inequalities in access and ownership of mobile phones that Araba Sey is going to guide us, to talk about the dynamics and processes of generating data for SDG 3, and then with Mamelu, and then we are going to move to the processes of the data. What can we do with the data? How important is the data, and what are the inequalities that are embedded in the data? And then we'll finish with Anisti, that will focus about the link of these inequalities, gender inequalities, and what is the impact in terms of access and use of sexual and reproductive health services. So it's among us, so we have WHO on the line, but feel free to interrupt and discuss. This is supposed to be a discussion. The presentations are going to be 20-30 minutes plus 15 minutes discussion, and hopefully at the end we have time also to discuss together the main ideas of the 4 presentations. Thank you.
Sorry, I think we just need people to use the mic because the WHO colleagues saying they can't hear anything.
Okay.
Hello. That's good. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about a variety of issues related to gender equality in access to digital technologies. And which one goes down? Down goes down. And most of the data I'm going to present and the issues I'm going to discuss are coming from a report that we prepared earlier this year, landscaping the state of gender equality, digital access, digital skills, and digital leadership. We released this report in March, and it has 2 main sections. One section focusing on analysis of official statistics, and the other more in-depth case studies written by a variety of scholars. I'm going to focus today primarily on the first section, which is just presenting some data on various dimensions of gender digital equality. And if you want more, you're welcome to look for this report, which is freely accessible online. So the 3 areas I'm going to be focusing on related to access to technologies, basic access to digital technologies, meaningful access to digital technologies, and then the dark side of digital technologies, which we sometimes call problematic access when we want to make our categories line up. Okay, so basic access, meaningful access, problematic access. And we found that it's really important to think about these dimensions, because if you focus only on one, you practically sabotage any efforts you're trying to make to promote either digital access itself or access to other benefits using digital technologies. So starting with basic access, we have 4 indicators here. And this will, this refrain will come up from me multiple times, that we want to know these things, but we don't have the data to actually know them. And so a lot of what we talk about is based on whatever data we can find. And when you're trying to look at these issues from a global perspective, then it becomes even more challenging, because it depends on what data individual countries share with the global bodies that try to consolidate these statistics. So ITU and the World Bank primarily collect information on proportion of individuals using a computer, proportion of individuals using the internet, people using a mobile phone, and people who own a mobile phone. And in fact, the ownership angle is a relatively new one that ITU just started collecting, precisely because over time, and especially from a gender perspective, it was recognized that using or being able to use a mobile phone is different from actually owning a mobile phone, and what you can do, what you can achieve, and what the outcomes are could be different. So first, thinking about the gender gap in computer use. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the gender gaps and not the proportion of women who are able to do A, B, C, or D, because we are not interested so much in that proportion as in whether or not there's a gap between men and women in being able to do these things. So if in a particular country, only 5% of women own a mobile phone, that sounds appalling, But if you look at the proportion of male or men who can access or use a mobile phone, and that percentage is 7%. That's different from that percentage being 90%, right? If the levels are low for everyone, then it may not necessarily be a gender problem. It may be a general access problem. And so we focus on the gap, and where the gaps are large or small, that's where we think there's a gender problem. That's not to say that the bigger problems are not important, but we are focused on the gender aspects here. So if you look at the gender gap in computer use, you can see first of all that there are very few countries even reporting on this data. So what we know is limited in a sense. We say from Africa, 6 countries that we have this data for. So does it make sense to say the gender gap in computer use in Africa is 10% when we know that this is only about 6 countries? It's not clear. Another refrain that I'm going to be making over and over again is, what does all this data actually mean? Because it's difficult to understand what it means when the data is patchy, or it's inconsistent, or it's from very few countries, and yet we are using it to represent global trends. And the caution is, whenever you hear these statistics that X% of women can do this or cannot do this, look behind those statistics to see who is that statistic is actually representing. So that being said, though, we see that in the countries for which we have the data, the gap ranges from 1%, which means that more women than men have access to computers, to negative 17%, which means that less women than men have access to and use computers. So the largest gaps seem to be in Asia, and the smallest gaps in Europe and Africa. But again, for Africa, it's only 6 countries, so who knows, there may be, the statistic might be completely different if we had all the 54 countries represented. The important thing to notice here, though, is that irrespective of that trend, what we found is that irrespective of the socioeconomic status of the country you're looking at, gender gaps seem to still exist, which is kind of curious. You think that in countries where there's the infrastructure that are more wealthy, that the gaps would be either very small or non-existent. But let's look at the top and bottom countries in terms of access to computer use. And you can see that in the top countries, so where it's red, more women than men use computers. And you'll see some maybe kind of surprising countries. Jamaica is there, Saudi Arabia is there, but then you have the usual suspects, Finland, Lithuania. That's not surprising that they have a higher or more balanced gender access. But look down here, Japan has one of the highest gender gaps in computer use based on the data. South Korea, some of the countries that have the best ICT infrastructure seem to have these gaps. We don't know why, but we see that they exist. And I think the next step needs to be, why is this actually happening? Reminds me of what the Parasites, MIGHT folks were talking about today, that we have the data, we have kind of a diagnosis, we even have a solution, but the prognosis in the middle, figuring out why is it like this in this place, what are the possible reasons, so that you can then link it to whatever potential solutions are there. That doesn't exist. But people see these figures and immediately they have a solution. You need to make technology more affordable, or you need to put the infrastructure in place. But sometimes even with the infrastructure in place, as we're seeing here, gaps still exist. Internet use, the story is the same. You see across the board that there are gaps, and here between 2013 and 2017, the gaps are actually widening in some parts of the world, while they've slightly declined in other parts of the world. In Africa, the gap is increasing, not clear why. And we also see that in the least developed countries, again, depending on how you parse the data, you start to see a different picture. In the least developed countries, the gap is particularly large and widening in internet use over time. And again, we have generally the gaps exist in most countries. So, for example, 29 out of 39 countries in those we have information for in Europe, there's a gender gap in favor of men, and similarly in Asia. And again, I mean, we see the countries here where there's a negative gap, and some of them are surprising. You know, Austria, Germany, where the gaps are amongst the lowest. So these are the 10 lowest, then the 10 highest. And so again, we don't understand why. Could it be that in these places it's people's choice? Women are choosing not to use it, and that the constraints there is different than in other countries. We just don't know. Mobile phone as a technology also, very little information available. Basically, these are the only countries that are consistently reporting this data. And again, you see it's kind of a mixed picture, right? In some countries, the gap is high in favor of men. And then, you know, every now and then you find some countries where the gap is, could also be high, but in favor of women. Leads me to a question that I'll probably bring up later on, is what does this mean? When you have a gender gap, are we assuming that it means women are disadvantaged? And how do we feel then when there is a gender gap that it's men who are disadvantaged? So if there's a 1% gender gap, meaning 1% fewer women having access to some technology, and we're going to say that that's a travesty, then when we see these instances where there is a 1, 2, 3% gap where it's men who are disadvantaged, should we be equally outraged that that situation exists? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it bears thinking about, because if it's a gap is a gap, is a gap, and we should be sort of even in what we think is right or wrong. I'll skip over this. It's showing sort of a similar story with ownership now rather than use of mobile phones, and also some of these unexpected countries where they're amongst the largest gaps. Hong Kong, South Korea, let's see, I think those were the Netherlands. You know, these are, we are surprised to find those showing up in the lower, the countries that have the largest gaps. And then, I mean, in the countries where things are more even, you have Costa Rica, you have Brazil, Colombia, Qatar, places where you think that women have a different status, let me say, and so you would expect that the gap would be bigger there. It seems that it's not the case. And this is particularly so for countries in the Middle East. There are a lot of them where there appears to be pretty balanced, or even more women using the technologies. Again, why? What's happening there that's making this possible? At this point, we don't know. So moving from, I talked about internet use before. Now I want to focus on mobile internet use. And one of the arguments that people often make is that the gender digital gaps have been closed now because everybody has a mobile phone. And so everybody can access the internet. If we look at this, we can see that that's not necessarily the case. So this table here, which you've already seen, this chart shows the gender gap in internet use, not mobile internet use, just general internet use. And in most cases, the gender the gap, yes, it's increasing, but the gap is 25%, say in Africa, for internet use, but the mobile internet use gap in Africa is 34%, according to GSMA's calculations. So it's actually higher than internet use, which suggests that access to mobile phones has actually not closed the gender digital gap in access to the internet. If anything, it has widened it. I will flag here that the way the gender gap is calculated also determines what the figure is. And I say this advisedly, but the way GSMA and some other institutions calculate the gender gap, sometimes you might find that it tends to produce a higher figure for the gender gap, but it's still usually within a certain range of the normal figures. So that's basic access, and those are the 4 indicators on which we have some data. Now, we know that, it's been established that just basic access is not enough to eliminate gender discriminations and gender inequalities. So in order to use the technology, to get a benefit from the technology, you need to be able to make take the fullest advantage of it. And there's some things that need to be in place for this to happen. And so we look at 3 of these potential intervening factors, which is the skills that people have to actually use the technologies at the basic level, but then also more advanced skills to be able to even become creators or innovators with the technology. And then the content and services, one, whether the material that's online is relevant to them, but also if they're actually able to use the various types of services, or if there's also a gap in those services that will enable them to get a maximum benefit. This is not advancing. Can I turn it off? No. Not be gender problems per se. It may be choice, it may be generational. I think for Europe, we had some data where this was broken down by age group, and it's really, for that we have to go to the level of looking at Eurostat data or OECD data, not the really global, because those don't have those distinctions. They have by age, but not by age, by gender. And we're looking at gender. And so this is, again, one of the issues of data collection. There's very little gender disaggregated data available, and then very little intersectionally, broken down, disaggregated data, so that you can see whether it's an issue with young men or old women or teenage girls. It's just very difficult to pass it out at this point.
And the same goes for the rural areas, stuff like that, right?
Yeah, rural urban.
South
Korea,
I can imagine that more the rural areas, the farmland, you have the older people that, there's a big gap. But if you look, for example, into Seoul or Busan, like the big cities, that you don't really have the gap over there.
Yeah. So it's, again, the issue is that we can only hypothesize about these reasons at this point. And someone has to take that next step to actually go and now look at different contexts to find out, to try and understand the figures that we are seeing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, have you got your hand raised?
Yeah, I just had a question linked to the data sources and sort of the definition of some of these indicators. I know, you're saying some of it is not entirely clear, but I was wondering, so if you could explain just, for example, mobile phone ownership. Is it possible that this is from surveys where it's sort of head of the household that gets asked, and then it's assumed that the person who is the head is the one who owns the device, or is it that sort of thing going on? And also related to mobile phone use or internet use, is it a yes or no type of thing? Do you have any data on intensity or?
No, I know some the definitions for internet access, for example, would ask, or internet use would ask, have you used the internet in the last 3 months? You know, and if you say yes, you're an internet user. For mobile phone use, sometimes it's also similar. You know, have you used it X number of times in the last week, and then that qualifies you as a mobile phone user. For mobile phone ownership, I don't know exactly how the questions are framed, but I know that increasingly they're trying to move away from household level or collecting only household level and actually now asking individuals about their...
I can answer that for the DHS. So the DHS has several modules, as you know. So the household module, it says, does anyone in this household own a mobile phone? So it's a catch-all. Right. Then for the women's module, it says, do you own a mobile phone? And that's it. And then under use, they only ask, do you use it for financial transactions? And that's it. Okay. Anyway, sorry.
I was just wondering whether, if there's a kind of a high-level analysis that looks at the different countries. So, for instance, can we link the extent of the gender gap to countries that fall in different categories in terms of their gender equality index or the rule of law or anything like that?
Yes, there have been a few academic studies that have tried to match, but gender equality with GDP, and some that I've tried to look at it with reference to ICT access and STEM education. And the interesting thing is that what they found is, in countries, they found the strangeness, because that we see here, where in countries that have low gender equality, there seems to be higher levels of women studying STEM. Now, I don't know what it looks like for access to the technologies. When you look at access, it looks like at the edges, it's what's expected. The very poor countries and the very rich countries, the trends are consistent, that you find that if there's low gender equality, there's also a low gender digital equality. In the higher country, with the richer countries, you find also the expected trends. But in the middle, it gets very confusing, because you have the countries all over the place. Some countries with low gender equality, high gender digital equality. Some countries with high gender equality, low gender digital equality. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. And I think there's a lot of qualitative work to be done as well, because the numbers just mask so much. That now we need to start looking at those countries that are not fitting the trend to try and understand what's happening in those particular contexts.
I'm going to present a plot that shows the ownership of mobile phones with gender inequality index, and as Araba said, everything is pushed in a way that countries with a higher level of inequalities are the country with a lower level of ownership, but in the middle can be mixed. But there's something interesting that I think, based on ITU data, also countries with the lower levels of penetration and access are the countries with the higher disparities. That shows that there's a kind of entitlement that if a resource is scarce, it will go for men first. So I think in 2 or 3 countries in West Africa, where and Somalia also, where the internet penetration is lower, the gender gap is huge. So so it's complex.
Yeah. Basically that's it. I mean, if I'm going to leave here with one message today, it's just that it's complicated. It's complex, not the relationship there. All right, so again, talking about basic digital skills, which you need to be able to do more sophisticated stuff, or sometimes very simple stuff on the internet or your mobile phone. Currently, these are the 9 indicators that ITU collects. I've lightened out the last one because that is might be considered a little bit more advanced. But a question I have for you is, I mean, right now, if we're talking about basic digital skills, is this what you would, is this what you would have in your bucket, your basket of skills that everyone needs, and women definitely need to be able to make the most beneficial use of the internet? I don't know. I mean, things have changed so much that, judging a person's digital skills based on these indicators might not really tell you anything. But this is all we have right now. So basically we have to go with it. And based on those, actually I'll stay here first. Based on those, the evidence is that in general, and all this data is self-reported. So it comes from surveys where people are self-reporting their skill levels or their ability to do these things. And it shows that across the board, men tend to perceive themselves to have these skills to a greater extent than women. There has been research that shows that men tend to overestimate their abilities, and that conversely, women tend to underestimate their abilities. So again, I don't know what this data means, and I'm here presenting it, but I have to say I just don't know what it means. But that's what the data is showing for the few countries that have reported it. Going to, and kind of addressing a little bit the earlier question I asked about which are the skills that people need, right? So beyond the basic skills, there are also more intermediate or advanced skills. Now when we say advanced skills, we're usually thinking about being able to program and do the more technical things. But what about things like social media use? Can we consider that as kind of an indicator of what skills you have? The Pew does some international research on social media use, which we came across, and so we thought it was also interesting to see the trends here. I was surprised to see that there actually, in general, seems to be more men saying that they use social media than women. That seems to be a little different from the general opinion we have that it's women and girls that engage the most on these platforms. But it just seems like in sort of all these countries, and these are the only countries where the data was collected, there's a huge gap.
Sorry, is this only out of those women that, only out of those individuals that own a phone or have access to, what's the denominator?
So still, I mean, the thing is, it seems there's a gender gap. And then I'll say again, the gender gap sometimes is in favor of men, sometimes it's in favor of women. So outreach should be equally distributed if we want to say that a gap is not good. Quickly moving on to content and services. This is what sort of things can people actually do online? What sort of things can women actually do online? There's a range of possibilities, from finance to health to entertainment and leisure to education, all the various development domains that it's anticipated will lead to better lives. Unfortunately, there is no data on most of these. The only thing we could find was some data on use of financial services and financial tools from World Bank's financial index surveys. And they collect data on people using a mobile phone or internet to access an account, using the internet to pay bills or buy something, making or receiving digital payments, and using mobile money. And what we found with the first...
Quick interruption. I'm just curious, in terms of the data, right? The usage, are they measured in terms of frequency of the users, or it's just like one hit and that's it?
For which
because you're talking about the gap, because you're talking about the usage. Because I'm assuming that maybe the measurement of frequency might impact the gap. I'm just curious whether that's
Yeah.
accounted for or maybe that's out of the equation.
I'm not sure. In some cases it is, so that you are qualified to fit into a certain bracket based on how many times you say you use it in the past week. But there are a lot of surveys also that just ask, do you use social media or do you use Facebook? Sometimes it's not even sort of the whole bucket. Yeah. So again, unclear. These are all the data issues that, and we're kind of so overwhelmed with data, but at the same time, we know so little and we can't use that data it doesn't really give us the insights that we want. I have to say that I find myself very confused and conflicted because I see all these trends in the data I'm looking at, but I don't know what it means because there's so many buts and provisos, in how to actually understand the data. So yeah, as I was saying, for digital transactions, we see that gaps exist. Some of them are big, but some of them are really small. So again, if it's a 1% gap, is that a problem to be solved? Is that where priority resources should go? I'm not sure. In most cases, women are less dominant users than men. But again, if you always, when we start looking at the top and the bottom 10 countries, you start seeing some of the surprising things. So here we have some of the usual, what we might expect, usual suspects, where there are much fewer women using a mobile phone to access an account, a bank account. So UAE may not be surprising, but UK, Hong Kong, it's a bit surprising to see them in the lower end. Digital transactions, same story, basically paying bills or making purchases, as well as using mobile money. For mobile money, for most of Europe, Asia, and Americas, the mobile money is not as big a thing as it is, say, in Africa and maybe some parts of Asia. So that could also explain some of the data we're seeing, but it's difficult to tell because World Bank did their surveys primarily in Africa and in Asia because that's where the mobile money phenomenon is happening. And so finally, the third dimension that we think is really important is the dark side of access. Our overall conclusion here is that all the benefits that we expect women and other people, obviously, to derive from technology can be derailed by their experience of having access to these technologies, as well as the way the rest of the world or let's say the male population responds to them having this access. And there are all kinds of dangers on the internet that exist equally for men and for women, but in some cases there are higher risks for women. So there's safety issues, there's security issues, privacy, there's backlash when women do get this access. And then there are intended consequences, that may be presented as unintended, but sometimes if you really look behind the story, you find out that somebody saw an opportunity to do something with the data because it was there, and that's why I put Femtech up there. Femtech now is a little bit controversial because we're beginning to hear either actual stories or alarm bells being rung about about the cost of women making their personal, data on feminine health issues accessible or available to the institutions that are providing them with these tools. So there's some questions about the unintended consequences of having this access. I have no data on these. Basically, they're all just stories we hear, cautions. we have data, for example, on violence against women. We have data on the real world violence against women, so physical violence by domestic or an intimate or non-intimate partner. So if we consider that as sort of a continuum where this behavior could be transferred online, then we can make some extrapolations to what women might experience by being online, and say that cyber violence is an issue. But we don't have any data at the global level, in any case, on this, so we can't really say what the state of these issues are. Overall, the 6 categories of barriers we identified, and we identified these from the literature. So we are not saying that these are the barriers, we're saying that this is what people who are researching the area are saying are the primary barriers. And they range from financial to sociocultural. Some of these may not be so relevant for access issues, for access challenges, but I mean, you can see how financial constraints would be an issue from the gender perspective, because if women are less likely to have control over resources, they have less ability to use the digital resources, both on a very basic level, but also the intensity of their use could be limited. But I personally believe that the sociocultural and institutional barriers are the most significant ones. And they're also the ones that nobody wants to face, nobody wants to address, because they're difficult. It's easier to say, let's make infrastructure available, let's make things more affordable, let's put in place, an area where women can go and access the internet safely, or we can maintain sort of the separation of women and men by putting them in different rooms and so on. So these are easier, but it's changing the hearts and minds of not just men, but sometimes the women who also sort of perpetuates these cultural distinction between what a woman can do, what a woman should or shouldn't do. If we don't address those, we are going to be continuing with this cycle, hitting targets on all the other 5, but we will not be able to meaningfully change things. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're getting a lot of backlash from the male population, because we are not addressing that. We're putting the Band-Aid on, and we're not actually addressing the problem, which is that societies and institutions need to change. Probably, I believe I have arguments with Mamelo with this, that we need to, it may almost be a case of us needing to start with a generation that's coming up, with the young children in primary school, elementary school, starting with that textbook that shows the doctor being a man and the nurse being a woman, and at that level, beginning to change it from that point. I mean, some of us, I think we're already past the stage where we can dramatically change those expectations. But if we start with the next generations, then there may be some hope that there will be a time when the idea that this is a male domain and this is a female domain will no longer exist. The purpose of this slide is not to show you what the solutions are. It's just to show you that there are so many barriers and equally so many solutions, and none of them can stand on their own. And so that's why it's so difficult to address these problems. You have to first understand what the actual barrier is, what the real issue is in the location in which you're trying to solve a problem, and then you need to figure out which of these solutions or which combination of these solutions might lead to at least has a high chance of being successful. But it's difficult to tell, and it's really confusing. And the data that we were able to patch together from different studies is often contradictory. So in some cases, you find that taking this action led to a positive outcome. In another location, the same action, and people do the research and it does not have any impact, or it has the opposite result. So we're still at the point of trying to make sense of what all this means. And because we don't have a lot of studies being replicated these days, it's difficult to do any meta-analysis to start seeing what the connection between solutions and outcomes are. Said this already, data is scarce, it's a moving target. Technology changes so fast that at the moment you think you finally captured what needs to be captured, there's a completely new thing that needs to be captured now. So who knows what the next technology is going to be, and then we'll have no way to know whether there's a gender gap there because we weren't collecting that data. So somehow we have to figure this out. But right now, the gender disaggregated data the data that we need to be able to assess gender digital equality mostly falls in tier 3 of UN's criteria, which means that there's no established definition, no methodology, and it's not collected. And in fact, some of the indicators that are placed in tier 1, based on our review of the available data, should either be in tier 2 or in tier 3. So finally, as I said, my conclusion is that this whole thing is complicated. And some of the questions that have arisen for me through the process of trying to see what the landscape of evidence looks like is, when we talk about gender, what do we mean? Do we mean male or female? Do we mean women? Do we mean everything in between and outside those barriers? If we mean any of those, once we know what we mean, then we know what we need to collect data on. Because if you're collecting gender disaggregated data and you're just asking, are you male, female, or other, you're not, you're only capturing a very limited perspective on gender, and you're leaving out a whole, a realm of people who identify themselves differently. What is digital? Is it laptop, phone, TV, AI, robots? In which of these does gender equality matter? So, is it okay if every woman has a phone, then we're good? But, someone or a man might have a phone, a laptop, and a desktop, right? Yeah, or a smartwatch or something. That quality of life, which is essential, where we want to say that this is what everybody should have. And as the technology changes, are we thinking in flexible enough ways to be able to keep up with those? Because as technologies advance, become more potentially transformative, it appears that the gender gaps, new gender gaps emerge, or the existing gaps actually start to widen. It's not clear. I don't know how we keep up with these developments, but something needs to happen at a very fundamental level so that we don't continue recreating the inequalities we are creating now. What is equality? Is it 50-50? Is it women more than men? Is that okay? Because it's women that have been disadvantaged all these years, and so it's okay if now men are disadvantaged. How do we make sure that we are not creating another problem by trying to solve the women's inequality problem? Is it equality in the experience of having access to technology? So not just having it, but the actual experience of it. Is that, are we able to assess and monitor and try to ensure there's equality in these areas? Equality in the outcomes. Is that something we also need to be paying attention to? Because again, having access to all the same tools does not necessarily mean the outcomes will be the same. And finally, what is access? Are you looking at it from the perspective of availability of data, the extent to which you can, availability of the technology, the extent to which you can afford the technology, how accessible the technology is, whether you have control over the technology, whether you are capable of using the technology, whether you can relate to the technology so that the relevant content, things that you want to do, you're able to do, whether you're safe and secure, whether it's relative to others, the access issue, whether you actually can enjoy the experience of having this access. These are all questions for me now. When a while ago I thought each of these were very simple things, gender is gender equality, digital access, they seem very clear, but I think we have a lot of work to do. And when we're going about trying to implement initiatives that leverage these technologies, we need to be thinking about these things and how we define them and what the implications of that are for the work that we do.
Any questions or comments?
So, you were saying that the barriers were were identified by going to the literature, right? And you mentioned before that data is changing so fast these days, so is the digital era. So, can you recall what the latest, when these articles were published? Because, like if it was, for example, 2005, then it might be not relevant at all anymore. That we have certain barriers. And also maybe there are like sub-themes within these barriers.
Yeah, we did this research in 2017 to 2018, and so the latest research that we would be reporting would be from early 2018. But we looked at literature for the last 20 years, something earlier. So we tried to pick up as much as we could, both from academic and grade literature. But you'll be surprised at how consistent these studies are in what the issues are. The same thing over and over and over again, irrespective of the technology. And that's why I say I think it's the institutional and cultural barriers that are the main ones, because you almost get tired at some point because you're reading all this literature. It's like, so someone had actually identified this, in 1990, that you need to make to train boys and girls, right, in gender roles, to understand that there's not a defined gender role. This is not news to anyone, but it's still, people are still having to raise this in the literature to say that this is something that needs to be addressed. So you find out that everything is new and everything is old. So we have a conference coming up next year, IDEA, and our theme is the more things change. Essentially, maybe the more they stay the same, maybe some things change, who knows. But generally, when I go through the literature, I feel the more things change, the more they stay the same, because we are hearing, seeing the same themes, the same issues come up with every new technology. And those were the 6 buckets that we felt that they all seem to fit into. But it's possible that there's some new things emerging that maybe when we look in the literature now, we would be able to identify.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. You asked some really provocative questions at the end, and I wanted to ask you a bit more your thoughts on what is equality in the digital access space. Because you mentioned, sort of, is it an issue if if men are more disadvantaged in certain spaces, or women? I mean, from a health perspective and what we do, I would say it's more about choice, and that that's what we want to get equality in. And also then you're thinking about outcomes. In the digital access space, is the outcome the access itself, sort of the ownership of the technology and the use of the technology? Is that the end that we're going for, and is that where you want to see equality, or is it about the choice and the kind of the choice to access or not? And I just was wondering if you had thoughts on that.
I think it's both and more. I'd say almost. So the access itself is an outcome. It's only the first stage of the outcome. Then there is the choice to be able to use the technology to the fullest that you want to, or not to, right? But then there's also what happens when you use the technology, and the potential that there are other factors that make it more possible for someone to get a positive outcome than for you to get that outcome. And that's a space that hasn't been examined so much, and I don't even know myself exactly what it would look like, but I feel that that's a gap in our knowledge. Is if a man and a woman went and did the exact same thing, you know, for example, I don't know, using an online system to apply for a job, right? But just by virtue of being a man or a woman, the outcome is different. There are studies that show that the wording of vacancy announcements, right, can influence who applies for a job or not, and that a lot of jobs are toned in masculine terms, you know, and so there's even a less, like, even when you have the access, the outcome for you is not going to be the same, because you won't even be inclined to take up some of the opportunities that you gain access to through the technology. So I think it's sort of those three levels. It's just, first, yes, you need to have the access, then you need to be able to use it the way you want to, and then you need to be able to get at least a chance at having an equal or a similar outcome to someone of a different gender. Yeah.
There's a question from Rachel.
From Amina, she asked us the literature talk about intergenerational differences, not just for men and women, but also across generations, such as the older, the younger men, girl and women. Another question is whether the content of the messaging on the technology is it worsening or perpetuating gender inequality. And finally, whether the technology development itself is gender biased, meaning that the design of apps, etc., is male normative. She's asking because, for example, we know that a lot of health diagnostics have been male nominated in terms of taking the male body as a reference.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So the first question about intergenerational analysis, there are some folks that are beginning to do life course studies, so looking at gender equality, gender digital equality from a life course perspective. And I think that's what takes into account these generational issues. So it's kind of like path dependent, sort of, or an accumulation of various decisions across one's lifespan, and in this case a woman's lifespan, sort of channels you in a particular direction that may keep on compounding and worsening the inequality between you and your male counterpart. So I know that research is happening. I don't think it's very mainstream yet, but at least it's beginning to, people are beginning to think about things from that perspective. I wasn't sure if I understood the second question. You said, is the concern about digital equality worsening the problem? I'm not sure if I fully understand, but one of my personal opinions is that sometimes the concern about certain elements of the digital world does contribute to gender equality, and usually in the sense that women need to be protected from the wild west of the internet or of life online, from cyber violence and all those things. So it's like the fact that it's a dangerous space for women, the fact that we say that women are more likely to be victims online, gives people who don't want women to have access anyway a rationale now to say, see, that's why I don't want my daughter or my wife or my sister to be able to go to an internet cafe and access the internet, because the internet cafe is full of men watching porn or gambling. So that then it becomes the reason for actually perpetrating the inequality. I think we can all probably do better and come up with ways. So that's why the problem that needs to be solved, right? Maybe is the men watching porn in the internet, or on the internet in open spaces, or what's wrong with a woman seeing a guy watching his porn? She can also go and watch her own porn if she wants to, right, in the same space. I mean, we need to find a way to stop thinking that there are some things that is okay for men to do but not okay for women to do, and try and create safe spaces for everyone, irrespective of your gender. So again, it goes back to cultural and institutional. If those are in place, then these other issues shouldn't be as big problems as they are. Is technology biased from the outset? Absolutely yes. And that's actually the area in which I am most interested, is the role that women do or do not play in the technology industry, both as employees, as employers, and as entrepreneurs in the industry. So there's a very, very low percentage of women, graduating in science subjects that are not natural sciences. So the technology and physics and mathematics, those subjects that lead people into technology careers, it seems that somehow, even though there's actually a balance of women in STEM studies, but most of them are studying medicine and the natural sciences. So they don't get the skills, not the skill set, but the qualifications that would enable them to get into the technology industry. But even when they do, and a lot of them do, then they face discrimination, often in the workplace, or they are hired into career pathways that don't lead them to have decision-making authority, where they can then have some influence on the way technologies are created. So we do need to have more women playing a role, not because women are better at anything, it's just because we need a diversity of voices, so that it's more likely that more issues will be incorporated into the technology when it's being developed. So yeah, I think absolutely that's a challenge, and it's one that increasingly the technology industry itself is being confronted with. I'd say maybe in the last 5 years they've been increasing attention to this question.
I think sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just to clarify the second question, it was mainly to ask that, you now with technology have possibilities of creating images of women and men that sort of play or worsen the stereotypes of women and girls as very hyper-sexualized or men as very super macho, and in ways that we know clearly, play into or build on these harmful norms that have existed. But I'm just wondering if the literature refers to the possibilities of technology to actually worsen or accentuate it that harmful for the kind of health issues that we see with extreme violence or extreme sexual violence. We know that for a lot of kids, you have images of porn and things and access to these things online in ways that can be damaging for their health.
Good morning.
Yes, and the simple answer to that is yes. The literature does cover that possibility. Most of it is, again, as I said, I was focusing more on the official statistics and what they are telling us. Most of these other dimensions, there just isn't data at the global level. There are contextual studies in different parts of the world, mostly in Europe and North America, that do shed some light on the potential and actual worsening of gender discrimination on online platforms, or facilitated or technology facilitated violence. So it's definitely an issue that people are at least trying to figure out ways to preempt. I wouldn't say preempt because it's already happening, but finding ways to address for the long term. Again, my simple mantra is just, we need to get everyone to treat everyone else like a human being, and most of these issues wouldn't be issues.